Okay. As with suffering, the biggest problem we face in discussing happiness is definition. For Aristotle, virtue is a necessary condition for happiness. For the Stoics, virtue is both necessary and sufficient. For Kant, there's no a priori connection between virtue and happiness at all. If the Stoics found satisfaction in rising above emotion, the Romantics found it in experiencing emotion to the fullest. What then is happiness? Is it contentment with one's life? Is it a balance of pleasure over pain? Is it a feeling of serenity? Is it a commitment to doing one's duty? Or flourishing in some yet undefined sense of the term flourish? Consider the Hebrew Bible. Although we may admire the characters for the values that they upheld, I think it can hardly be said that any of the major characters in the Hebrew Bible were happy. As soon as Abraham arrives in the Promised Land, he's forced to commit famine, war, death threats, and a wife who's barren. Isaac is tricked by his wife and his youngest son. Jacob is tricked by his father-in-law and eventually his own sons. Moses is forced to take a job he does not want, lead a rebellious people through the desert, and at the end of his life cannot enter the Promised Land. Jeremiah is beaten, imprisoned, and ignored. And yet, for all of their misery, these characters do help us to define what we mean by human fulfillment. And I'll put all my cards on the table. I'm much more comfortable with human fulfillment than I am with happiness, and the paper will try to explain why. The traditional view, Jewish view, as articulated by the rabbis, is that happiness consists in obedience to the commandments. And hence the Ashrei prayer. Ashrei is, in Hebrew, the word usually translated happiness or blessedness. So the Ashrei prayer is recited 3 times a day by the faithful. And the prayer says, and I quote, "Happy are the people whose God is the Lord." Happy are the people whose God is the Lord. Note, however, that while some commandments in the Torah call for joy or celebration, others call for mourning or self-affliction. And there's no getting around the fact that throughout the ages, the people, quote, "the people whose God is the Lord," have been subjected to every conceivable form of humiliation. Much the same is true, I think, with the concept of suffering. Can one suffer and still flourish or be fulfilled in a deeper sense of the term? According to 2nd Isaiah, of course, the answer is yes. The true servant of God is despised, diseased, ignored, and led like a sheep to the slaughter. In Christianity, this is a foretelling of Jesus. In Judaism, this is referring to the Jewish people as a whole. Despite, or perhaps even because of such misfortune, the suffering servant becomes a paradigm of human existence because he suffers for a higher purpose. Although most people would not regard the suffering servant as happy, appearances can be deceiving. Indeed, we may ask whether one can achieve, here's the question, can you achieve spiritual fulfillment without suffering, both on your own account or for the sake of others? Maybe suffering and fulfillment are not opposites at all. According to the late Rabbi, Lord, I think it's Lord Rabbi David Sachs, and I quote, "There's a kind of fulfillment for which happiness seems somehow the wrong word," and I couldn't agree more. That consists in having taken part in a struggle or having one's best, of not having compromised by bowing down to the self-images of the age. Happiness just doesn't seem to sort of capture that. If this is true, then so far from being incompatible with fulfillment, some form of suffering may be integral to it. Everything that comes down, I think, to what one regards as the purpose of life. For the Epicureans, the purpose of life is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. For the Stoics, pain and pleasure are irrelevant. All that matters is the pursuit of virtue. For many of the medieval thinkers, all that matters is the development of the intellect. For the rabbis, again, it's obedience to the commandments. The goal, then, is how to shed light on such an elusive concept. The issue before us can be seen as the outcome of a debate that arose in the ancient world, again from the Hebrew Bible. Closeness to God, or obedience to God, in the Bible at least, does not guarantee a happy life in the normal sense of the term. There are wars, famines, bitter conflicts, even among devoted adherents to God. The ancient Israelites faced the perennial problem of how a small nation sandwiched between major powers like Egypt and Assyria, or eventually Egypt and Babylonia, could prosper. Eventually, both the northern and southern kingdoms of the Israelites were destroyed, and the temple in Jerusalem was razed to the ground twice, first by the Babylonians, second by the Romans. You know, whenever you look at this history, if you've ever seen the play Fiddler on the Roof, remember what one of the major characters, Tevye, says at one point? He looks up and he says, couldn't somebody else be the chosen people once in a while? What then is the Hebrew Bible really trying to tell us? And to answer this question, we have to ask another. What is the connection between, I'll go slowly, what is the connection between good fortune on the one hand and flourishing or fulfillment on the other? They're not the same. What's their connection? Aristotle thought that the highest good attainable by action is happiness, eudaimonia, which we can understand as living well or doing well. It is customary to point out the English word happiness. Now, here's where we're going to get into the etymology. The English word happiness does not really capture Aristotle's meaning of eudaimonia. In the first place, happiness in English is derived from hap, which means luck or fortune. In the second place, happiness often, in English at least, often has hedonistic implications, implying a temporary feeling of satisfaction or pleasure. By contrast, Aristotle is talking about an objective measure of achievement over an extended period of time. So I know we translate normally, if you read Aristotle, eudaimonia is happiness. Be careful with that. In an effort to achieve greater clarity, Aristotle defines eudaimonia as the activity of the soul in conformity with virtue. That's his definition. Gratification purchased at the cost of ignorance, cruelty, or isolation from other people simply doesn't count. It's not what he means at all. The problem is that this is for Aristotle, it's nearly impossible to acquire many of the virtues Aristotle recommends unless one has external goods, such as friends, wealth, and political power. He says that. A person who is poor or lives alone cannot lead soldiers into battle, make important decisions of state, or be philanthropic. These are all Aristotelian virtues. Aristotle goes on to include, this is for what you need, he thinks, to help you be virtuous, good looks, high birth, and children. These are all external goods, but he thinks that you really need these if you're going to have exemplify a lot of the virtues that he talks about. Now, he's not saying that possession of these things guarantees happiness or eudaimonia, but rather that their absence makes happiness very difficult to obtain. That's Aristotle's view. Now, against this in the ancient world, we have the view of the Stoics, exactly the opposite. I quote Diogenes Laertius. The Stoics say that some things are good, others are bad, and others are neither good nor bad. Fair enough. The virtues, prudence, justice, courage, moderation, and the rest are good. The opposite of these, foolishness, injustice, and the rest are bad. And now, everything else, everything other than virtue or vice, does neither benefit or harm. In other words, here they include health, pleasure, beauty, strength, wealth, reputation, noble birth, and even life itself. And these things, they say, you should be indifferent to. You should be indifferent to anything other than virtue or vice. So death, you should be indifferent to the fact that you're going to die. You should be indifferent if you lose your health, your wealth, or your reputation. Because the only thing that matters is virtue or vice. According to the Stoic view, then, the only thing that's valuable as an end in itself is virtue. Since external goods like beauty, strength, or wealth have nothing to do with a person's virtue, they don't count. In principle, now here we go, in principle, a person can be poor yet happy. Think about Socrates. Powerless yet happy, or in a deeper sense of happiness. Or sick yet happy, because sickness has nothing to do with your virtue. If economic forces undermine my financial condition, or if age takes away my strength, rather than sinking into despair, I should stand back and ask whether I've really been harmed. If not, then I should focus on those things that cause genuine benefit or harm, which would mean those things within my control, which would mean my pursuit of virtue. So we have in the ancient world a basic difference between Aristotle and the Stoics. There's another way of saying that for the Stoics, happiness is a matter of rational self-control. The difference between Aristotle and the Stoics raises the same question as the Hebrew Bible. On Aristotle's account, it would be anomalous to say that the suffering servant of God is happy in any sense of the term. On the Stoic account, it would make perfectly good sense. So which one do we side with? With the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 A.D., 2 failed revolts against Rome, and minority status in foreign lands, Judaism faced this question head-on. How could one think of the Jews as God's chosen people if they're constantly being pushed around by superior forces? In view of this, it was natural for Jewish thinkers, and here's one of my major claims, it was natural for Jewish thinkers to side with the Stoics. Especially true for people like Maimonides and Spinoza. Spinoza actually quotes the Stoics. Now here, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the Jewish sources embraced Stoicism in its entirety. No, they didn't. The Hebrew prophets were hardly exemplars of Stoic apatheia, no matter how we understand that term. Rather, it is to say that the standards for evaluating human life have less to do with external goods like wealth and power, and more to do with internal goods, this is for Judaism, like piety, humility, and self-control. Example, this is from a Mishnaic text. Who is wise? He who learns from all people. Who is mighty? He who subdues his passion. Who is rich? He who rejoices in his portion. Who is worthy of honor? He who respects his fellow human beings. And you can see exactly what they've done here. They've taken away, to define these things, They've taken away external goods. You don't have to be a warrior to be mighty. You don't have to have a palace to be rich. You don't have to be a king to be worthy of honor. They've taken all that away. This allowed a subjugated people living in exile to still think of themselves as wise, mighty, and worthy of honor, which is to say that despite outward appearances, they could still think of themselves as happy in some sense of the term. It's important to remember, though, that Judaism does not, and here I emphatically, Judaism does not embrace asceticism. There's no law, there's no commandment mandating celibacy or a vow of poverty. While there are days for communal fasting and mourning, there are also days of merriment and celebration. In the words of the Deuteronomy, you are commanded to rejoice before the Lord. It's sort of an interesting commandment. I mean, basically to say you're commanded to have a good time once in a while. As to what that means and how you do it, we can discuss that. But you are commanded to enjoy yourself at certain times. It's a divine commandment. In the words of a Talmudic source, you're going to be held to account in heaven for all the pleasures in this life that you could have had but didn't. The Jewish view of human fulfillment underwent, though, a profound change in the Middle Ages when rabbinic tradition encountered the philosophic. According to Maimonides, simple obedience to the commandments is not enough. You have to study secular subjects like logic, mathematics, and astronomy to understand the worldview on which the commandments are based. In his eyes, love of God, or the supreme human fulfillment, goes hand in hand with knowledge of God. And this is another way of saying human flourishing reaches its highest point in intellectual contemplation. That's the true end of life. As he reads the story of Job, as Maimonides reads the story of Job, the character is blameless and upright at the beginning, but not wise or intelligent. And that's right, the text says that he is upright. It never credits him with knowledge at the beginning. And this is significant because according to Maimonides, knowledge is the only thing worth pursuing as an end in itself. The Maimonides is the intellectualist par excellence. It follows that while Job is beset with sickness, loss of property, loss of family members, all things external to a human being, he is, according to Maimonides, by the end of the story, when he hears the voice of God, he realizes that these things don't matter. The loss of his health, the loss of his friends, the loss of his wealth, they don't count. And that's, of course, exactly the Stoic position. Because he realizes at the end when God speaks to him that all that really matters is knowledge, and he gets knowledge at the end. And therefore, says Maimonides, human fulfillment is measured by development of the intellect, and that's what the story of Job is trying to tell us. Spatial limitations prevent me from discussing how Spinoza adopted almost exactly the same position. I will just have a brief quote. It is of the first most importance, in this is Spinoza, in life to perfect the intellect or reason as far as we can. The highest happiness or blessedness for mankind consists in the perfect of the intellect alone. Blessedness is nothing other than self-contentment that arises from knowledge of God, Spinoza. This strong intellectualism. By the 18th century, though, Judaism undergoes a profound change. As the intellectualist tradition gives way to a much more democratic one. A lot of this is due to Kant. Kant proclaims that the moral law is known to everyone, even the simplest. He says that. It has nothing to do with the development of your intellect. In fact, Kant is often suspicious of people who claim a high moral standing because they've improved their mind. He doesn't trust it. Kant, as I say, it's the moral law is written, known to everyone, even the most simple. And to use a biblical expression, which Kant uses, it is written on the heart of every person. The moral law is written on the heart of every person. That's an allusion to the book of Deuteronomy. In the Jewish world, Moses Mendelssohn expressed virtually the same view when he said that all people are destined to felicity, and the means for attaining it are as widespread as mankind itself, as charitably dispensed as the means of warding off hunger and other natural needs. So they're giving up the intellectualism of the Middle Ages. Beyond this, Kant departed from much of the ethical theory that preceded him by Kant is denying that the purpose of life is to pursue happiness. It's just not true for him. Although every rational agent wants to be happy, it's impossible to formulate a clear and consistent account of what happiness is, says Kant. At a rudimentary level, it's the satisfaction of desire or the ability to get what one wants. To make happiness the formulation of a moral system, therefore, would be for Kant to enshrine the principle of self-love or just simply selfishness. It would be to turn morality on its head. Not only is happiness unacceptable as a moral foundation for Kant, it's unworkable as a prudential foundation as well, because it's impossible for a finite being to know in detail what will satisfy his or her desires. Wealth may bring anxiety, envy, or danger. Long life may come with pain or disappointment. Health may contribute to various forms of excess. Even knowledge may bring to light things a person would rather not know. Kant therefore concludes that it's impossible to determine how to promote happiness with any degree of certainty. In short, happiness is not, for Kant, it's not an idea of reason, but rather an idea of the imagination. As such, it cannot be the foundation of a moral imperative. And yet, for all of his rejection of happiness as a moral principle, this is important, Kant can't give up on it entirely. Granted that we can conceive of a vicious person who gets almost everything he wants and a virtuous one who is tormented, still, the idea of a virtuous person who is tormented offends us deeply. Just when we read the book of Job, we're offended, just as Job was offended. Something's wrong here. Just as moral agents, we cannot help but think that a person who is virtuous is worthy of happiness, and that anyone who is worthy of happiness ought to get it. A world in which everyone is virtuous but no one is happy may be possible in principle, but let's face it, it's totally unacceptable to us. From this, Kant concludes that we have a duty to sympathize with other people who are in need and to see that their happiness is commensurate with their virtue. In other words, we have a duty for Kant to promote what he calls the highest good. The highest good is a condition in which everyone worthy of happiness gets it. Or, if you will, everyone's happiness is proportionate to their virtue. That's the highest good that we all are obliged to pursue it. Now, I mentioned Kant because he had a major influence on Hermann Cohen. At first, it would appear that Cohen was even more skeptical of happiness than Kant. No matter how nuanced, happiness cannot, says Cohen, cannot be a rational idea. A quote from Cohen: "There is certainly an inherent harmony in the fact that," listen to this, "along the entire arc of Jewish philosophy, happiness is repudiated," says Cohen. All of Jewish philosophy says happiness is repudiated. That's just not true. Just absolutely not true. Trust me. Cohen wrote that in his strong anti-eudaimonistic period, that he was going to be even more anti-eudaimonistic than Kant. He rejected Kant's idea of the highest good, for example. Cohen himself repudiates Kant's idea of the highest good as a condition in which everyone who is virtuous obtains happiness, on the grounds that it concedes too much to pleasure and self-love. In other words, Cohen said that Kant wasn't true to his own principles. By bringing happiness back into the system, he was allowing self-love and selfishness back into the system. So far from enshrining happiness as the goal of life, Cohen emphasizes the redemptive power of suffering. Sounds a bit Christian, no? Including the age-old suffering of the Jewish people as a whole. If, as the Torah tells us, God loves the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, then as the prototype of human suffering, the Jewish people have a special relationship with God. This does not mean that God grants the Jewish people special favors, quite the contrary, but that God loves the Jewish people as a symbol of the human condition because of their vulnerability. Cohen argues then that the Jewish people are the suffering servants of humanity, as mentioned in 2nd Isaiah. In fact, their suffering is their source of dignity as a people. Take away their suffering and they kind of lose their identity. This accords with the view of biblical heroes outlined above. To the degree that one suffers for a higher cause, one acquires a sense of purpose, even nobility. In other words, it's not paradoxical to say that a person or group of people might take satisfaction in their suffering if it serves a noble end. If so, then suffering would not only be compatible with happiness in some sense, but as I said, an essential part of it. That's Cohen. Despite his emphasis on suffering, Cohen follows Jewish tradition. He does follow in rejecting asceticism. As we saw, one is supposed to rejoice on festival days. To this, Cohen adds that joy, Freude, one is supposed to experience on these occasions is neither private nor entirely pleasure-based. The commandment to rejoice calls for a public rather than a private celebration, including the shared joy of the stranger and the poor. You're supposed to invite the stranger and the poor into your house on a festival day. You're supposed to break bread with the stranger, drink wine with the stranger, establish a relation of fellowship with the stranger. I suggest that by emphasizing joy and contentment, one feels Cohen too has left room for happiness. So just as Kant starts out by rejecting happiness and then in the end backpedals and lets it in the back door, so does Cohen. Despite that strong statement that all of Jewish philosophy renounced happiness, he can't get himself to quite do it either, and talks about the joy of festival days. And then in his words at a later stage, I do not oppose the feeling of happiness. Well, actually he did, but only the idea of its absoluteness. Okay, but he's clearly backpedaling. It's clear then that while they denied that happiness is the final end of life, neither Kant nor Cohen could analyze the meaning of human life without it. Like most great thinkers, Cohen had his critics. For the most part, they objected that his idealism was too close to the intellectualism of the Middle Ages. Buber wanted a return to a personal God. Rosenzweig thought that Cohen had abandoned idealism in favor of existentialism. Levinas wanted an ethical system based on the immediate perception of the face of another person, all adopted, to use Buber's term, a dialogical view of human life. For present purposes, I can't go into all of this in detail. It is instructive to look at the early Hasidic writings of Martin Buber. Against the intellectualism of the medieval philosophers or the demanding Torah study associated with the rabbis, Buber found a new source of inspiration in the religious fervor with which Hasidic Jews hallowed everyday experiences. Everything in the world contains a spark or trace of divinity which can be discovered and then celebrated. Even in the simplest task or encounter, there can be the source of a spiritual experience. In Buber's words, the members of a Hasidic community are unique in that, let me quote him, they drink to one another. They sing and dance together, tell one another abstruse and comforting miracle tales. But they help one another too. They're prepared to risk their lives for a comrade, and this readiness comes from the source of their elation. Again, note elation. Everything the true Hasid does or does not do mirrors his belief that in spite of the intolerable suffering man must endure, the heartbeat of life is holy joy, and that always and everywhere one forces a way through to that joy, provided one devotes one's entirety to his deeds, his entire self entirely to his deeds. End of quote. In a community where everyone looks for religious meaning and is open to spiritual renewal, it is as if singing, dancing, eating, even working become forms of prayer. This should not be understood as a glorified hedonism, even though we're talking about joy and elation. The Hasid lives a life of piety as defined by the Torah. The point is their piety is joyful rather than onerous, which in some ways isn't all that different from Cohen when he began to backpedal. Okay, to sum up, there's no such thing as the Jewish view of happiness. There's just too much disagreement in the tradition, but rather a conglomeration of views that reflect the cultural context in which they were developed. The commandments remain primary even if the rationale for obeying them changes. So the elusiveness of the concept of happiness is still with us. I think it'll always be with us. Does one immerse oneself in the everyday world to find spiritual fulfillment, or make every effort to rise above it? If happiness is so difficult to get a grip on, how should we fulfill the duty to promote the happiness of other people, as Kant and Cohen have it? Why has God created a world in which virtue and happiness don't always go together? Though some may bemoan the fact that there is so much disagreement, I do not. I actually think it's a good thing. Obtaining happiness is not like baking a cake or building a house, in that it cannot be achieved by taking a series of pre-described steps to a clearly identifiable end. To achieve it under any of the descriptions we have examined, one must first answer fundamental questions about human life and the things one stands for. Before taking up the question of how to be happy, then, one must follow the imperative written on the temple of Apollo thousands of years ago. And I hope I'm allowed to quote a pagan source in this group. You won't throw me out. I can quote a pagan source. What's written on the temple of Apollo thousands of years ago, Gnothi sauton, know thyself. You can't really even begin to pursue happiness without knowing yourself and who you are and what you stand for. If knowing oneself involves struggle, disappointment, and disillusionment, so be it. The fact remains that without such knowledge, happiness in any legitimate sense of the term is unobtainable. Thank you.